She threw the coins onto the counter, and every man in that roadside inn turned to stare. Not because of the sound, because of her. Clara Whitmore was a large woman, heavy in the hips, round in the face, wide in the shoulders, and she had learned long ago that walking into a room meant bracing herself for what came next. But she had not expected the innkeeper to laugh. Not out loud. Not like that. Not while his wife stood 3 feet away pretending not to hear. "You're applying for the cook position," the innkeeper said, and it wasn't a question. It was the beginning of a joke he hadn't finished yet. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "I have 7 years of experience. I can work any hour you need, and I won't ask for anything I haven't earned." He looked her up and down the way a man looks at livestock he's already decided not to buy. "I need somebody who can move fast in a tight kitchen," he said, "not somebody who's going to get stuck between the stove and the wall." The men at the counter laughed. Clara picked her coins back up. She did not cry until she was 3 miles down the road and certain nobody could see her. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside you, please take 1 second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Clara, because what happens next will stay with you. Montana Territory. In the summer of 1887 was not a place that forgave weakness, and it was not a place that welcomed women who looked like Clara Whitmore. She had been moving for 11 days by the time she saw the sign for Black Pine Ranch, hand-painted on a weathered plank, and nailed to a fence post that leaned slightly toward the east, like it had given up trying to stand straight. The mountains rose behind it, purple and enormous in the afternoon light, and the road leading to the main house was rutted deep from wagon wheels and hard rain. Clara stopped at that fence post and pressed her palm flat against the wood. Her boots had given out 2 days back. The left sole had separated from the upper, and she'd tied it back together with a length of cord she found on the road. Her dress-faded brown cotton she'd owned for 3 years had a tear along the left sleeve she'd sewn twice already, and it had come undone again. The cloth bag hanging from her right hand held everything she owned in the world. A spare petticoat, her mother's small handwritten recipe book with the cover falling off a tin cup, and $4.30 that had to last her until she found work, or she didn't. She was 25 years old. She was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. And she walked through that gate anyway. The first man who saw her was a young ranch hand named Pete Garland, maybe 19 years old, with red dust on his boots and a gap between his front teeth. He was carrying a saddle toward the barn when he spotted her coming up the road, and he stopped dead. He looked at her the way young men look at something unexpected, not yet cruel, just calculating, figuring out what category to put her in. Clara met his eyes and kept walking. "Ma'am," he said, because his mother had raised him well enough to say that much. But he said it the way boys say things when they don't mean to be kind, like a formality before the real response. "Good afternoon," Clara said. "I'm looking for the ranch owner. I heard in town there might be a cook position available." Pete Garland opened his mouth and then closed it again. He looked toward the bunkhouse where 2 other men had stopped what they were doing to watch. "That'd be Mr. Brooks," Pete said. But, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His eyes said it for him. They traveled over her, the size of her, the worn clothing, the tied-together boot, and what he was thinking was written plain as a wanted poster across his young face. He didn't think she'd get the job. He didn't think she deserved it. And he was already preparing himself to laugh when she was turned away. "I'll find him," Clara said, and kept walking. The 2 men outside the bunkhouse were less careful than Pete. One of them, barrel-chested with a thick brown beard and a hat pushed back on his head, let out a low whistle that wasn't a compliment. The other one, lean and sun-darkened with arms like rope, leaned against the wall and said something to his companion in a voice low enough that Clara wasn't meant to hear all of it, but she caught the shape of it. She always caught the shape of it. Something about the table needing to be reinforced. Something about the food supply not lasting the winter. Clara stopped walking. She turned and looked directly at them. Not with anger. with something steadier than anger. Something that had been built over 25 years of moments exactly like this one, layered one on top of another until it had turned to stone somewhere behind her sternum. "You got something to say to me," she said. "You're welcome to say it where I can hear it proper." The lean man straightened off the wall, grinned. "I was just saying," he said, "that a woman your size must be one hell of a good cook, seeing as you do a lot of quality testing." The other one snorted. Clara looked at them both for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned back toward the main house and kept walking. Her hands were completely steady. That was the thing about humiliation when you'd lived inside it long enough. It stopped shaking your hands. It started shaking something deeper, something you couldn't see, something that cracked slowly over years and years until you weren't sure what was holding you together anymore. But your hands stayed steady, because you needed them to. She found Nathaniel Brooks coming out of the barn. He was tall and lean himself, 42 years old, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been handsome once and was now something better weathered and real, with deep-set lines around the eyes from years of squinting into the sun and years of something else. Something heavier than sun. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he had grease on his right forearm from whatever he'd been doing in the barn. He pulled the barn door shut behind him, and then he saw her standing there, and he stopped. He did not laugh. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he needs to solve, not a woman he needed to evaluate, not a figure he needed to judge. Just a person standing in his yard, and he was trying to figure out what had brought her there and what she needed. "Mr. Brooks," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I've been cooking professionally for 7 years. I've managed kitchens at 2 separate establishments in this territory, and I know how to stretch supplies in hard months and feed a large crew without wasting anything. I heard you lost your last cook 3 weeks ago, and the position hasn't been filled." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "Where'd you hear that?" he said. "Town," she said. "Hardware store. 2 men talking while I was looking at work notices posted on the wall." He tilted his head slightly. "You walked out from town." "Walked out yesterday morning. Slept at the base of the ridge last night." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she had learned to recognize pity, and this wasn't it. It was something closer to attention. Like she'd said something that required him to recalibrate. "You got references?" he asked. "I've got a reference letter from the Harlow Inn 2 territories over, and one from a cattle operation in Wyoming, where I fed 38 men 3 times a day for 2 seasons. She reached into her cloth bag and produced 2 folded pieces of paper, slightly wrinkled from the journey, and held them out to him. He took them and read them both slowly, the way a man reads something when he actually intends to know what it says, rather than just appearing to look at it. Behind Clara, she heard footsteps approaching, the lean man from the bunkhouse coming closer. He said something to Nathaniel. She was meant to hear something about how the previous cook had at least looked like he could lift a pan without breaking the floor. He said it with a grin, expecting Nathaniel to grin back. Nathaniel didn't look up from the papers. "Go see to the east fence, Ethan," he said. "3rd rail is loose again." The grin dropped off the lean man's face. He looked at the back of Nathaniel's head, then at Clara. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Clara filed that away somewhere. Nathaniel folded the reference letters and handed them back to her. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I've had 3 cooks in 2 years. The first one drank. The second one couldn't keep a schedule. The third one lasted 4 months and then said the men were too hard to cook for and quit. I need someone who can handle this ranch's particular variety of difficult." "What kind of difficult are we talking about?" Clara asked. "Men who've gotten used to eating bad food and complaining about it. Men who think a kitchen is somewhere women go to stay out of trouble. Men who haven't had a decent meal since—" He stopped. Something crossed his face too fast to read. "In a while," he finished. Clara looked at him steadily. "I've cooked for men who told me they'd been eating trail dust so long they forgot what real food tasted like. I've cooked for men who cried at supper without knowing why. I know what it is to feed a room full of people who have forgotten they're allowed to feel something." She paused. "I'm not frightened of difficult." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I can give you one chance," he said finally. "One supper. You cook tonight, I watch how the men respond. If it's what you say it is, you stay and we talk terms. If not—" "I leave in the morning," Clara said. "That's fair." He nodded. Then he said something that Clara would remember for a long time. "The men here, they're going to make remarks. Some of them don't know any better, and some of them do, and choose not to anyway. I can tell them to stop, but I can't tell them to mean it. You'll have to decide what you do with that." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I've been deciding what to do with that my entire life. It hasn't stopped me yet." He held her gaze for a beat longer than expected. "Kitchen's through the back of the main house," he said. "I'll have someone show you where the supplies are kept." Clara picked up her cloth bag and walked toward the main house and did not let herself feel anything yet. Feeling things was for later in private when the work was done. Right now there was a kitchen to assess and a supper to plan and a single chance she intended not to waste. The kitchen was in rough shape. That was the charitable way to put it. The stove had a damaged flue that made the back burners run hot and uneven. 2 of the cabinet doors had been pulled off their hinges and never rehung. The floor had a soft spot near the window that meant the boards underneath were rotting from old water damage. The pantry held flour-dried beans, a partial side of salted beef, some preserved tomatoes, a sack of cornmeal, a handful of dried herbs that had lost most of their potency, and very little else. It was the kind of kitchen that had already surrendered. Clara walked through it slowly, touching the stove, opening the pantry twice, checking the fireplace that backed up against the far wall. She looked at the wood stacked beside it. She looked at the state of the pots, 3 of them mismatched, one with a warped lid. The ranch hand who'd been sent to show her around a quiet older man named Walter Hayes with white eyebrows and big hands, and the particular stillness of someone who had seen a great deal of life and decided that most of it was none of his business, stood in the doorway watching her. "Previous cook called this the worst kitchen in the territory," he said. "Previous cook was probably right," Clara said. She crouched down in front of the stove and examined the flue situation. But right doesn't mean much when supper needs to be on the table. Walter Hayes was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know what I'm doing," Clara confirmed. He nodded once slowly, like a man who had been waiting for that answer for a while. Then he said, "I'll bring you more wood. The pile out back has better pieces than what's stacked in here." He paused. "And there's dried apples in the cellar that the last cook didn't find. Good ones." Clara looked up at him. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Walter," he said, and went to get the wood. Clara stood up and looked at the kitchen around her, the busted flue, the missing cabinet doors, the sad pantry, the warped pot lid, and she felt the familiar settling that happened whenever she stood in a kitchen that needed her. This was what she understood. Not people, not whether they would accept her or mock her or decide she was worth keeping, not the calculus of belonging which she had never been able to solve, but a kitchen with not enough, a crew that needed feeding, the problem of how to make something from almost nothing that would matter to the people who ate it. That she understood completely. She rolled her sleeves up and got to work. What Clara made that night from that poor pantry and that difficult stove was not extravagant. It was never going to be extravagant. She had one partial side of salted beef, which she soaked in cold water for 2 hours while she worked on everything else, drawing out enough of the salt to make it usable. She slow-cooked it with the dried herbs and the preserved tomatoes and water, and let it go low and long while she managed the hot spots on the back burners, with a rotation she worked out through trial and error in the first 40 minutes. She made biscuits from the cornmeal and flour, heavy and golden, the kind that hold together when you're working and aren't meant to be delicate. She found the dried apples Walter brought from the cellar and soaked them and cooked them down with a small amount of the brown sugar she found in a tin at the very back of the pantry shelf, not enough to be sweet, but enough to be something. The back burners burned the first batch of biscuits. Clara scraped them, adjusted, and started a second batch. The stew was going to be good. She knew it the way she always knew, not from tasting it obsessively, but from the smell, from the sound of it, from the color it turned at a certain point in the cooking that told her something chemical and fundamental had happened, and the result was going to be right. She heard the men coming in for supper before she saw them. Their boots on the porch, the voices loud, overlapping the particular social noise of men who spend all day working in relative silence and then fill up the supper hour with everything they'd been holding. And then, one by one, they came through the door and stopped. Not because of her, not this time, because of the smell. Clara had her back to the room, ladling stew into the big serving pot she'd found in the bottom of the pantry. She heard the shift in the room, the way you hear weather changing, the voices, dropping, the footsteps, slowing. She heard someone say something, and someone else say something back, and she couldn't make out the words, but she felt the texture of it change. She turned around with the serving pot and set it on the table. The men were watching her. Ethan Cole, the lean, sun-darkened one from the bunkhouse, who had made the joke about the floor, stood near the far end of the table. His expression was complicated. He was still holding on to his contempt the way a man holds on to a losing hand because he hasn't admitted yet that he's lost. Clara met his eyes and then looked away. She set out the biscuits. She set out the cooked apples. She put the serving spoon down and stepped back. "Supper's ready," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Walter Hayes walked to the table, pulled out his chair, and sat down. He reached for the serving spoon with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who has decided something and doesn't require an audience for it. He ladled stew into his bowl. He tore a biscuit in half. He put the first bite in his mouth. The room was very quiet. Walter Hayes chewed slowly. He set his spoon down. He looked at the biscuit in his hand. Then he said in a voice that carried the particular weight of a man who does not waste words, "Been a long time since I remembered what home tasted like." Clara felt something shift in her chest, some small, carefully managed thing that she kept locked down, because it was too dangerous to let it move freely. The man next to Walter reached for the serving spoon. Then the man next to him. Then they were all reaching, and the sound of the room changed again. The spoons against the bowls, the biscuits being torn, the low sounds men make when they're eating something real. The voices dropped, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was something more important to do than talk. Pete Garland, the young gap-toothed one who'd watched her come through the gate, had a second helping before Clara had even sat down. He didn't say anything to her. But he didn't smirk either, and that was its own kind of progress. Ethan Cole ate his first bowl in silence. He pushed the empty bowl back slightly. Then he pulled it in front of him again and reached for the serving spoon. He did not look at Clara when he did it, but she saw. Nathaniel Brooks sat at the head of the table. He ate slowly, the way a man eats when he's paying attention to something other than the food, when he's watching and thinking and processing. He went through one full bowl and most of a second one. At the end of the meal, he folded his napkin. Clara had found a stack of them in a drawer, wrinkled, clearly unused for a long time, and set it beside his bowl, and looked down the table at the men. They were still there. That was the thing he noticed first. She could see it on his face. They were still at the table. Most nights, according to what Walter had told her while she worked, the men ate fast and scattered back to the bunkhouse, away from the main house, anywhere that wasn't the dining room. They ate to fuel themselves and left. Tonight, they stayed. Two of them had started a low conversation about something that happened on the south pasture. One man was laughing. The youngest hand, a boy of maybe 16 named Cody, who'd barely spoken all evening, was working through his third biscuit with the focused pleasure of someone who hadn't eaten properly in longer than he could say. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Clara waited. "Terms," he said. "We'll talk in the morning about terms." Clara nodded once. She began clearing the table. She didn't let herself feel it, not yet, not here, but somewhere beneath the locked-down, careful place where she kept the things she couldn't afford to feel in front of people, something small and exhausted and terribly hungry for exactly this uncurled just slightly. She had walked 14 miles in a shoe tied together with cord. She had been laughed out of the last 3 jobs she'd applied for. She had slept on the ground at the base of a ridge with her cloth bag as a pillow and listened to the sounds of the Montana dark and told herself, the way she always told herself, that tomorrow would be different. And here was a table full of men who had stayed. Here was a man at the head of it who hadn't laughed at her once. Here was a kitchen that needed her. It wasn't a home yet. It wasn't safety yet. It wasn't anything she could trust or rely on or believe in fully, because she had learned slowly and at great cost that the moments that felt like turning points were sometimes just cruelties delayed. But it was supper, and the men had stayed. And Walter Hayes had remembered what home tasted like. And for tonight at this broken-down ranch at the edge of the Montana mountains, that was enough to keep moving forward. She washed the pots in the dark kitchen, with the sound of the men's voices coming from the other room, and the Montana wind finding its way through the gap in the window frame, and she let herself think very quietly just once. Maybe this time is different. Then she put that thought away where it was safe, and she finished the dishes, and she prepared herself for morning. The morning after supper, Clara was already in the kitchen before the sun cleared the ridge. She hadn't slept well. Not because the cot they'd given her in the small room off the back of the main house was uncomfortable, it was, but she'd slept on worse, and not because the Montana wind kept finding that gap in the window frame and pressing cold fingers through it all night. She hadn't slept well because she was waiting. She always slept badly when she was waiting to find out if something good was going to last. She had the coffee on and biscuits started by the time Walter Hayes came through the kitchen door at 5:20, the way she somehow already knew he would. He was the kind of man who rose with the dark, who had spent so many decades waking before everyone else that his body had simply stopped consulting the sun about it. He stopped when he saw the coffee. He looked at it. Then he looked at Clara. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Sit down, Walter." He sat. She poured. He wrapped both big hands around the cup the way old men do when their joints ache in the morning cold, and he drank, and he didn't say anything for a while. Clara worked around him, measuring out flour, checking the back burners with the particular attentiveness the flu situation required. "Boys are going to come in expecting last night to have been a dream," Walter said finally. "Then I'll just have to make sure breakfast convinces them it wasn't," Clara said. Walter made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell with him. He kept most things tamped down low, like a fire banked for the night. But something shifted around his eyes. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked. Clara kept her hands moving. "My mother. She could take a near-empty pantry and feed 12 people and make every one of them feel like she'd been planning the meal all week." "She's still living?" "No, sir." "Sorry to hear it." "She'd have liked this kitchen," Clara said. "She always said difficult kitchens made better cooks, said easy kitchens made you lazy." She paused. "I'm not sure she was wrong." Walter turned his cup in his hands. "That stove's going to fight you every single day." "I know," Clara said. "I've already made my peace with it." He was quiet again for a moment. Then, "Ethan Cole is going to be a problem." Clara didn't break her rhythm. "I figured. He's not a bad man," Walter said in the careful way of someone who has decided to be honest, even when honesty is complicated. "He's just the kind of man who needs someone to be less than him. Took him a while to find it with you." He paused. "He's going to try harder now that last night didn't go the way he expected." Clara looked over at him. "Why are you telling me this?" Walter met her eyes steadily. "Because I've been on this ranch for 6 years, and I've watched 3 good cooks walk out that door because nobody warned them what they were walking into." He set his cup down. "You're not like the others. I could see that yesterday, so I'm telling you." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Walter," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, getting up from the chair. "Just stay." He went out to start his morning work, and Clara stood in the kitchen and breathed, and felt something tight in her chest that she couldn't quite name and didn't try to. She had work to do. Nathaniel came in at 6:30 while the men were still filing through for breakfast. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, rather than going to the dining room, watching Clara manage the stove, and the serving, and the particular chaos of feeding 12 men in a limited space before they all had to be somewhere else by 7. "Sit down," Clara told him, not unkindly, without turning around. "You're making me nervous standing there." She heard something behind her that she thought might be the beginning of a surprised laugh quickly managed. He sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, not the dining room, not at the head of his own table, but the small working table where she'd been prepping. He poured his own coffee from the pot on the counter, and he watched her work. "Terms," he said after a few minutes. "Terms." Clara agreed and turned down the heat on the back left burner before it went too far. $12 a month, he said. "Room and board included, which means the room you slept in last night. Sundays off, except for morning and evening meals, which are lighter than weekdays. You take 1 full day every 2 weeks as completely your own." Clara flipped the last of the bacon onto the serving plate. $14. A brief pause. 13. 13 and a half, Clara said. "And I need a new flue pipe for that back section of the stove within the month, or I can't promise you what the cooking's going to be like when winter hits and I have to run all 6 burners at once." Another pause, longer this time. "Done," Nathaniel said. Clara brought the bacon plate to the pass-through to the dining room and came back and sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee. It was the first time she'd sat down since 4:30 in the morning. They looked at each other across the small table. "I want to be straight with you about something," Clara said. "Go ahead. I heard what you said yesterday, about the men making remarks and you can't make them mean it when they stop." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I've been fighting them myself for a long time and I know how. But I need to know that this kitchen is mine to run. That nobody comes in here and starts telling me how to do my job or what I should be cooking or why I'm doing it wrong and then turns to you and finds out you agree with them." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, thinking, not stalling. "That kitchen is yours," he said. "What happens in it is your call. I'll tell the men." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me," he said in a way that was so similar to what Walter had said that Clara almost smiled. "Just cook." She did. She cooked every day for the next 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks changed the shape of Black Pine Ranch in ways that Clara didn't fully understand until she could look back at them later. It started with small things. Men who used to grab their food and disappear started sitting at the table and finishing their meals. Conversations that used to stop when Clara walked through started continuing in her presence, which meant they stopped thinking of her as an interruption and started thinking of her as furniture, and she understood enough about men to know that furniture was actually a step up from what they'd thought of her before. Furniture belonged. Furniture was part of the house. Young Cody, who was 16 and orphaned and had come to work at Black Pine because he had nowhere else to go, started appearing at the kitchen door in the late mornings when the rush was done and Clara was prepping for the midday meal. He never asked for anything. He just appeared quiet and watchful, the way stray animals appear when they've learned that a particular place is safe. The first time Clara handed him a piece of bread without looking at him and said, "If you're going to stand in my door, you might as well be useful. Those dried beans need sorting." He came in and sorted the beans. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the second week, he was peeling vegetables and learning to read the back burners. And Clara was teaching him things she'd learned from her mother, without calling it teaching, just talking, just saying things out loud that happened to be information about how heat works, and why you salt water before it boils, and what a good stew sounds like when it's right, versus when it's getting away from you. Cody didn't talk much, but he listened with his whole body the way people listen when they're trying to memorize something they're afraid they won't get to hear again. What Clara did not know was that Nathaniel watched all of this. He had a way of being present at the edges of things in the barn door at the far end of the porch that meant he saw a great deal without appearing to be watching. He saw Cody in the kitchen doorway, and then inside it. He saw the men staying at the table. He saw Walter Hayes, who had eaten his meals in 20 minutes flat for 6 years, still sitting with a cup of coffee, 25 minutes after supper, talking to the man next to him. He saw the ranch remembering it was alive. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected a good cook, maybe even a great cook. He'd hired for the food because the food was what was visibly failing men, grumbling turnover high morale, low in the particular flat way of people who've stopped expecting anything to be good. He hadn't expected whatever this was, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't put a name to yet. The thing with Ethan Cole happened at the end of the third week on a Thursday evening, when the heat had been punishing all day, and everyone's patience was thin. Clara was at the stove. The dining room was filling up. She was managing the back burners with one hand and stirring the large pot with the other when she heard Ethan's voice carry from the dining room through the pass-through. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the man beside him, but his voice had that particular carrying quality that some men develop when they want to be overheard without appearing to aim at anyone specific. "Still say Brooks is soft for keeping her on," Ethan was saying. "Any woman worth her salt wouldn't need 3 weeks to figure out a kitchen. Fast cook is a good cook. This one takes all day just to get supper ready." Clara kept stirring. "She does all right," the man next to Ethan said mildly. It was a man named Frank, broad-shouldered and quiet, who had been one of the ones to laugh that first day and had said nothing directly to Clara since. "She does all right for what she is," Ethan said. "But what she is ain't exactly what this ranch needs walking around the main house every day. Men don't need the distraction." Clara set the spoon down very carefully on the edge of the pot. She walked to the pass-through. Every man in the dining room looked up. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was completely level. He turned. Something flickered across his face. Surprise mostly at the directness. He'd been talking about her as if she couldn't hear him, as if the walls of the kitchen made her absent. "You got something you want to say about my work," Clara said. "You say it to me, not to Frank and not to the table, to me, and you say it out loud, not sideways." The room was very still. Ethan held her gaze. His jaw worked slightly. "I was having a private conversation," he said. "Private conversation carrying through a pass-through into my kitchen isn't private," Clara said. "It's public, so say it public." A few seconds passed, the kind that feel much longer than they are. Ethan pushed back from the table slightly. "I said you take too long," he said, and his voice had dropped the conversational tone and was harder now, stripped down. "Supper's supposed to be on the table at 6. Some nights it's 6:15, 6:20. Men are tired. They don't want to wait. Last 3 nights' supper was on the table at 6 o'clock exactly," Clara said. "Night before that it was 6:10 because the flu gave me trouble and I had to rebuild the fire twice. I sent word out at 5:45 that it would be late. You got that word." "Everybody got that word," Frank said, not quite under his breath. Ethan's neck colored slightly. "I'm also running a pantry that was half empty when I got here and stretching it to feed 12 men 3 times a day." Clara continued. "If you'd like to talk to Mr. Brooks about increasing the supply budget, I'd support that conversation fully. If what you actually want is to complain about my cooking or my speed, or the fact that I'm in this kitchen at all, then I'd ask you to consider whether this is really about supper, or whether it's about something else." The silence in the room shifted quality entirely. Ethan stared at her. Clara met his eyes and did not look away. It was Pete Garland, of all people, young Pete with the gap teeth who'd watched her walk through the gate that first day, who broke it. He said quietly and without flourish, "I ain't had a meal this good since my mother's kitchen, just speaking for myself." Someone else said same. Frank said, "Supper's fine, Ethan, let it go." Ethan looked at the table, at his hands, at the plate in front of him. He picked up his fork and ate. He didn't apologize. Clara hadn't expected him to. But he ate, and he was quiet, and that was its own kind of answer, and when she went back to the kitchen, she stood with her hands flat on the counter and breathed slowly for a count of 10. Her hands were steady. She finished serving supper. What she didn't know, what she found out later from Walter, who told her things in the matter-of-fact way he told her things, as if information was just another kind of supply that needed to be properly distributed, was that Nathaniel had been standing in the doorway at the far end of the dining room during the entire exchange. He had not stepped in. He had watched Clara handle it. And according to Walter, who had watched Nathaniel watching, something had changed in his face during those few minutes that Walter had no particular word for, but that he felt was worth mentioning. "He looked at you like he was seeing something he didn't know how to account for," Walter told her. "What does that mean?" Clara said. Walter shrugged his big shoulders. "Means he's starting to notice you're not what he hired." Clara frowned. "I'm exactly what he hired." "No," Walter said patiently, as if explaining something to someone who was being willfully slow. "He hired a cook. You're something else." He paused. "He just hasn't figured out the word for it yet." Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she handed Walter a bowl of stewed apples and told him to go eat them somewhere she didn't have to think about what he'd just said. He went looking faintly amused. The word for it came to Nathaniel Brooks, or the beginning of it did, on a Sunday evening in the 4th week. Clara had Sundays lighter as agreed. She put out a cold supper early and didn't do formal cooking for the midday meal. The men fended for themselves at noon on Sundays, which mostly meant bread and whatever was left from Saturday night, and nobody complained because the rest of the week was good enough that one light day felt reasonable. But on this Sunday evening, Clara was in the kitchen anyway, not because she had to be, but because she was working through her mother's recipe book. The cover had come entirely off at this point, and she'd been meaning to stitch it back on, and she sat at the small table with thread and a needle, and the loose pages spread out in front of her, stitching the spine back together with the careful, deliberate stitches of someone doing something that matters. Nathaniel came in looking for the coffee pot. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. He looked at the pages spread out on the table, the faded handwriting, the small stains that were old enough to be part of the paper. Now the penciled notes in the margins in a different hand that was Clara's own, added over years. "Your mother's?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Cover finally gave out. Been threatening to for a year." He came and poured his coffee, and he didn't leave. He stood by the counter, which Clara had come to understand was his version of sitting. He found it easier to be somewhere, if he was technically in the process of leaving it. "She teach you everything in there?" he asked, nodding at the book. "Everything and more," Clara said. "Half of what I know isn't in there at all. It's just in my hands." She paused. She used to say recipes were maps, useful for finding your way, but the people who know the territory don't need them. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you lose her?" 4 years, Clara said. "She got sick in the fall and was gone by winter. She kept her stitches even and small. It was fast, which people kept telling me was a mercy. I'm not sure I ever agreed." "No," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice had changed, flattened, slightly gone interior. "Fast doesn't feel like mercy when it's happening." Clara looked up at him. He was looking at his coffee. She understood then something about the lines around his eyes, about the particular quality of his silences, about the way he moved through his own house like a man who had learned to take up less space than he was entitled to. "Your wife," she said. Not a question exactly, more like an acknowledgement. 5 years ago," he said. "Fever, 3 days." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "People keep telling me that too," he said, and his voice held no bitterness, just a long, tired familiarity with the phrase. 5 years of sorry from everyone in the territory." He paused. "Not that I don't understand why they say it. I just don't know what to do with it after a while." "You don't have to do anything with it," Clara said. "People say it because they don't have a better word. Doesn't mean they're wrong." He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she didn't know how to read, yet she hadn't learned him well enough. Something considering. Something that was deciding something. "The men are different," he said. "Since you came. You probably know that." "I can see it," Clara said carefully. Walter stayed at the table after supper 3 nights in a row, Nathaniel said. Man hasn't done that in 5 years to my knowledge. Cody's the boy actually smiles now. I didn't know he had it in him. He stopped, set his cup down. I don't know what to call what you're doing. It's not just cooking. It's the same thing my mother did, Clara said. She used to say that feeding people is just the door. What they're actually hungry for is something else. Something harder to make. She looked back at her stitching. She was right. She was always right. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said so quietly that Clara almost missed it. My wife used to say something like that. The kitchen was very still. Clara kept her eyes on her work and gave him the silence, the way you give a man room to stand up straight without comment, without making it something that required a response. After a while he picked up his coffee and said goodnight and went out. And Clara sat with her mother's half-stitched book and the quiet kitchen, and the sound of the Montana night pressing against the window, and she thought about doors, about what people were hungry for when food was only the beginning, about what she was hungry for. She had not let herself think about that in a long time. She was careful not to think about it too clearly now. But it was there. The 4th week became the 5th, and the rhythm of Black Pine Ranch reorganized itself around Clara's kitchen, the way water reorganizes itself around a new stone in its path, not stopping, not fighting, just finding the shape of moving around the thing that had appeared. The men stopped making jokes. Not all at once, and not because anyone told them to, but because the jokes started feeling stupid when you were eating the best food you'd had in years, and sleeping better, and noticing that the days felt slightly less like something to endure. Ethan Cole went quiet on the subject of Clara entirely, which was not the same as accepting her, but was at least the absence of active hostility, and Clara counted it. She started making improvements. The pantry was the first thing. She sat down with Nathaniel at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a piece of paper and a pencil and laid out exactly what was being spent versus what was needed versus what could be saved. And she explained in plain language the language of numbers and waste and efficiency that she'd learned from watching every kitchen she'd ever worked in either succeed or fail. How the current system was spending more money for worse results than it needed to. Nathaniel listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and practical, and Clara answered them with the confidence of someone who had done the arithmetic twice before sitting down. He approved the changes. By the start of the 6th week, the pantry had real depth to it, proper supplies, better preserved goods. Clara started teaching the men nearest the kitchen, Cody and a quiet man named Hector, who turned out to have grown up on a farm and understood preservation in ways the others didn't, how to store things for winter. She did it practically without ceremony. The way she did everything. Here is the problem. Here is what we know, here is what we're going to do about it. But the thing that undid her, the thing she didn't see coming, the thing that cracked something open in that carefully maintained interior of hers that she'd thought was sealed, happened on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of the 6th week. She was in the pantry doing inventory when she heard raised voices outside. Not the ordinary raised voices of men working the different kind. The kind with an edge. She came out of the pantry and went to the kitchen window, and what she saw made her go very still. There was a wagon on the road in front of the main house. A man on the wagon expensively dressed for the territory with a hat that cost more than Clara made in a month. 2 men on horseback beside him, and Nathaniel standing in the road in front of the wagon, and the conversation between him and the man in the expensive hat was not a conversation in any comfortable sense of the word. Clara went to the kitchen door and opened it. She heard the man in the hat say with the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced being pleasant while being dangerous, "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, Nathaniel. The western pasture land has been in dispute since your wife's time. All I'm asking is for a surveyor to come out and set this right properly." "There's nothing to set right," Nathaniel said. "That land was settled legally. The deed is registered in Helena." "Deeds get disputed," the man said pleasantly. "Not this one," Nathaniel said. The man smiled. It was the smile of someone who found other people's certainty amusing because he knew something they didn't. "We'll see," he said. He looked past Nathaniel toward the main house, and he saw Clara in the kitchen doorway. His eyes moved over her the way she was used to eyes moving over her. Assessment. Categorization. A small private contempt that he didn't bother to hide because he didn't think it needed hiding in front of a woman like her. "That your new cook?" he said to Nathaniel. "That's Miss Whitmore who runs my kitchen," Nathaniel said, and his voice had changed. Gone quiet. The particular quiet that Clara was learning meant something in him had locked. "Interesting choice," the man said. Nathaniel turned and looked at him with an expression Clara could see clearly from the doorway. "Richard." Nathaniel said, "I think we're done here. Richard Holloway." Because that was who it was, Clara would learn the largest landowner in the surrounding territory, and the kind of man who had been the largest something for so long, he had confused size with right, looked at Nathaniel for a moment longer. Then he tipped his expensive hat and turned his wagon around, with the unhurried confidence of a man who intends to come back. Nathaniel stood in the road until the wagon was out of sight. Then he turned and saw Clara still in the doorway. He walked toward her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were far away in the particular way that meant he was still in the conversation in his head, still working through it, still angry in the internal controlled way of a man who has learned not to let anger make his decisions. "Who is he?" Clara said. "Richard Holloway." Nathaniel came through the door, and she moved aside to let him. "He's been trying to get that western pasture for 2 years. Usually he sends lawyers. This is the first time he's come himself." "That means something," Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. Something crossed his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd said it, that she'd understood it. "Yes," he said. "It does." He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and Clara looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, and the controlled anger in his face, and the 5 years of alone that lived in him like furniture. You stopped seeing because it had always been there, and she made a decision. She went to the stove and put the coffee on. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me about the land." He looked at her. "Clara, I run a kitchen," she said. "I can't run a ranch, I know that, but I can listen, and sometimes listening is what a problem needs before it can be solved." She turned and looked at him directly. "Sit down, Nathaniel." He sat. He told her about the land, about the western pasture and the original deed and the surveys that had been done, and the surveys Holloway claimed contradicted them. He told her about the 2 years of lawyers and the subtle pressures that had come in other forms. Suppliers who suddenly had difficulty filling orders for black pine, a water rights issue that had appeared and then disappeared, a buyer for their cattle last fall who had backed out at the last minute without explanation. Clara listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them practical. When he was done, she said, "The deed. Where is it?" "Helena, filed with the territorial office." "You have a copy here?" He paused. "Somewhere." "Find it," Clara said. "Find it and every piece of paper connected to that land and put it somewhere you know exactly where it is, not somewhere. Somewhere specific." He looked at her. "If that man comes back with a lawyer," Clara said, "the first thing they're going to do is make you feel uncertain about what you know. Paper doesn't get uncertain. Paper just is what it is." She paused. "My mother always said when someone is trying to make you doubt what you know is true, put it on paper and keep it where you can see it." Nathaniel was very quiet. "Your mother said that?" he asked. "She was a practical woman," Clara said. He looked at her across the small kitchen table, and she looked back at him, and the coffee pot began to make its sound on the stove, and outside a hawk called once and was answered by nothing. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you walked through that gate," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. Such a plain, unguarded thing, the kind of thing people say when they have run out of the energy required to say something more carefully managed. Clara felt it land in her chest like a stone in still water, the ripple of it moving outward into places she had told herself were sealed. She looked away first. "Go find those papers," she said. "I've got a midday meal to finish." He went, And Clara stood at her stove with her back to the empty kitchen and the coffee beginning to boil, and let herself feel very briefly and very privately the particular terror of realizing that she had started to care about whether this place lasted. Whether these people lasted. Whether the man who had just said a simple, unguarded thing to her would look at her the same way next week and the week after that, or whether she was waiting, as she was always waiting, for the moment when the thing that felt like safety turned out to be something else. She was not safe yet. She was maybe getting there. And the distance between those two things was exactly the length of everything that could still go wrong. She finished the coffee and started the midday meal and told herself to be careful. And then she cooked anyway, the way she always did, fully, without holding back, putting everything she had into the pots and the heat and the food that would go to the table where people were starting slowly and imperfectly to trust that good things could happen twice. The papers were in a wooden box under Nathaniel's desk, which Clara learned about not because he told her, but because Walter mentioned it the next morning in the particular offhand way Walter mentioned things he'd decided were her business to know. "He found them last night," Walter said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "Sat up until past midnight going through everything. Had them all laid out on the desk when I came through at 5. "Did he find what he needed?" Clara asked. "Found more than he expected," Walter said. "That's what had him up so late." Clara looked at him. "What does that mean?" Walter set his cup down. "Means whatever Holloway's surveyor claimed is wrong and Nathaniel can prove it. Means the man has been lying in legal language for 2 years, and the truth has been sitting in a box under a desk the whole time." He paused. "Also means Holloway knows exactly what he's doing, which makes him more dangerous, not less." Clara absorbed that. "Does Nathaniel understand that?" she asked. "He does now," Walter said. And then he picked up his cup and finished his coffee and went out to start his day, leaving Clara to work through the implications of that alone, which she suspected was exactly what he intended. She was thinking about Holloway when Nathaniel came into the kitchen that morning with a different energy. Tighter, more focused, the faraway quality in his eyes replaced by something present and sharp. He poured his coffee and he stood by the counter and he said without preamble, "He filed a false survey claim with the territorial office in March." Clara kept her hands moving on the bread dough. "You can prove it's false. I can prove the original survey was done by a registered surveyor in 1879, and the boundary markers it established are still exactly where they were put." He paused. "The survey Holloway filed claims 3 of those markers were placed incorrectly due to instrument error. He's saying the western boundary of my land is 40 yards east of where I've always believed it was." 40 yards, Clara said. "What's on those 40 yards?" "Water," Nathaniel said. "A creek that feeds the western pasture from spring through early fall. Without it, that pasture can't run cattle through the dry months." He looked at her. "Without that pasture, I lose roughly 1/3 of my grazing capacity." "And without 1/3 of your grazing capacity," Clara said. "The ranch doesn't survive at current scale," he said simply. "I'd have to sell off half the herd, maybe more. And once word got around that Black Pine was contracting—" He stopped. "Holloway knows this territory. He knows how it works. You show weakness out here and the people who've been waiting decide it's time." Clara pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "So it's not really about 40 yards. "It was never about 40 yards. Nathaniel said. "It was always about the whole thing." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the men were starting their morning work voices calling across the yard, the sound of the barn door hoofbeats on the dry ground. "You need a lawyer," Clara said. "I have a lawyer. In Helena. Man named Greer. He's good." Nathaniel set his cup down. "I sent him a wire this morning. He'll be here by the end of the week." "That's good," Clara said. "It's a start," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice told her he knew a start was a long way from finished. He went out to manage his ranch, and Clara went on managing her kitchen, and for 3 days, the surface of Black Pine operated the way it always did. Meals at the right hours, men at their work, the ordinary business of a working cattle operation moving forward the way it had to, regardless of what was happening underneath. But underneath was moving too. Clara felt it. The way you feel weather before. It arrives a change in pressure, a particular quality of waiting. The men picked it up from Nathaniel without him saying anything directly, the way men who work together absorb the mood of the operation, the way they absorb everything else through proximity and attention, and the accumulated instinct of people who have to read situations accurately because their livelihoods depend on it. Supper conversations got quieter. Not cold, not the old flatness from before Clara came, but more measured. More interior. Men thinking about things they weren't saying out loud. Ethan Cole, of all people, came to Clara on the second of those 3 days. She was in the pantry doing the afternoon inventory when she heard him in the kitchen doorway and turned to find him standing there with his hat in his hands, literally physically holding his hat at waist level in a gesture that in a man like Ethan meant something significant. Men like Ethan didn't hold their hats unless they were in a church or delivering bad news or saying something that cost them. Clara waited. "I want to say something," Ethan said. "Go ahead," Clara said. He looked at his hat, then at her. His jaw worked in that way it had. "What I said, in the first weeks." He stopped, started again. "The things I said weren't fair. I knew they weren't fair when I said them, and I said them anyway. And I've been—" Another stop. "I don't have a good reason for it. I just had a habit of it. And habits are hard to notice until something makes you notice them." Clara looked at him. "What made you notice?" she asked. Not unkind, genuinely curious. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Cody," he said. "Kid hasn't smiled in the 2 years he's been here. Not once. I know because I noticed it and thought it was just his nature." He paused. "He smiled 3 times last week. In the kitchen, learning something from you." He turned his hat slightly in his hands. "Made me think about what I'd been saying about the kitchen. About you." Another pause. "Made me think I'd been wrong." Clara held his gaze. "Apology accepted, Ethan," she said. He nodded once quickly, like a man who needed to finish this before his nerve ran out. "Also," he said, and now his voice changed, became less confessional and more practical, which was more natural territory for him. "If Holloway comes back on this land business, and he will, I want you to know that every man on this ranch will stand with Nathaniel, including me, whatever that means when it comes to it." He put his hat back on and walked out before Clara could respond. She stood in the pantry for a moment. Then she went back to her inventory and wrote down what she needed and told herself that people were capable of surprising you if you gave them enough time, and that this was both one of the best things about people and one of the most complicated. The lawyer Greer arrived on Friday. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the contained energy of someone who had learned that showing less of yourself in a room meant people underestimated you, and that being underestimated was often an advantage. He came with a briefcase and a methodical mind, and he sat with Nathaniel in the front room for 3 hours on Friday afternoon while Clara ran the kitchen and wondered what was being decided. Walter brought her the summary as Walter did. "Survey's clean," Walter said. "Greer says Nathaniel's original deed and the 1879 survey are airtight. Holloway's claim is based on a survey done by a man named Aldous. And Greer knows Aldous says Aldous has done flexible work for flexible money before. Says if they can get the territorial office to compare the 2 surveys properly, Holloway's falls apart." "If," Clara said. "If," Walter agreed. "Territorial office doesn't move fast. Holloway knows people there. Greer knows people there too, but different people." He shrugged his big shoulders. "Takes time. Maybe a lot of it." "And in the meantime, Holloway can keep pressuring," Clara said. "That's usually how men like him work," Walter said. "Make the thing so expensive and exhausting that the other man gives up before it ever gets to a real decision." Clara thought about that. "He's counting on Nathaniel not having the resources to outlast him," she said. "He's probably right to count on it," Walter said with the bleak honesty that was one of the things Clara had come to respect most about him. "Holloway's got 3 times the land and 10 times the money. A long legal fight is nothing to him. To Nathaniel—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Then we can't let it become a long legal fight," Clara said. Walter looked at her. Clara looked back at him and felt the word sitting there between them and understood that she had said it without thinking and that it was true. "We," she said. Walter looked at her for another moment. Then something happened around his eyes that was the closest thing to openly please that she had ever seen from him. "All right," he said. "We." The first move Holloway made after the lawyer's visit was not legal. Clara hadn't expected it to be. It came through the town, the way so many things came through the town, through the particular social infrastructure of a small Western community, where information moved fast and reputation moved faster, and what people thought of you in the feed store and the dry goods and the church steps mattered in ways that were both practical and impossible to legislate against. She heard about it from Cody, who heard it from Pete Garland, who had gone into town for supplies on Saturday morning and come back with the supplies and something else. Cody appeared in the kitchen doorway at 11 on Saturday with the particular expression of someone who is carrying something they don't want to carry. "Cody," Clara said. "What's wrong?" "Pete went into town," Cody said. "I know. What happened?" Cody came inside. He stood by the small table and didn't sit down, which meant it was something he couldn't be still for. "People are talking," he said, "about you." Clara set down what she was holding. "Tell me," she said. Cody's jaw tightened in a way that was very young and very furious at once. "Someone Pete didn't know who started it, but it was going around. Someone's been saying that Mr. Brooks keeping you on here isn't just about cooking. That there's something—" He stopped. His face colored. "Something improper about why he keeps you close." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara felt it hit her. Not surprised she had lived long enough and been a woman long enough to know that this was always one of the available weapons. Not surprise, but a particular specific hurt that she recognized, the kind that found the places you'd thought were adequately armored and discovered they weren't. She breathed. "Who else heard Pete say this?" she asked. "Me," Cody said. "And Walter, and Ethan." "Ethan," Clara said. "He—" Cody looked at his hands. "He got real quiet, and then he got real loud." "What does that mean?" "He told Pete that anyone in town spreading that kind of lie about you or Mr. Brooks was going to answer for it personally, and that he'd be going back into town on Monday to make sure that was understood clearly." Clara stared at him. "Ethan said that," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Cody said. And then, with the particular earnestness of a 16-year-old who has decided that something matters and intends to say so regardless of how it comes out. "I know it doesn't fix it, what they're saying. But I wanted you to know that nobody here believes it. Nobody who matters." Clara looked at him. This boy who had been silent and half invisible and hungry in some way that food alone couldn't reach when she arrived, and she felt something move in her chest that bypassed all her careful management entirely. "Thank you, Cody," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He nodded. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" Clara picked back up what she'd set down. "I'm going to finish this midday meal," she said. "And then I'm going to think." Cody looked at her for a moment. Then he came to the table and sat down and picked up the knife she'd been using and started doing what she'd taught him to do without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, and the silence was the kind that held something rather than nothing. Nathaniel found out before supper. She didn't know how, whether Ethan told him or Walter, or whether word had found its own way, the way word always found its own way in small contained communities. But he came into the kitchen at 4 p.m, and he closed the door behind him, which he had never done before, and he looked at her with an expression that was several things at once. "You've heard," Clara said. "I've heard," he said. "Then you know what Holloway's doing," she said. "He can't shake you legally yet, so he's trying something else. If he can make the town question your judgment, your character, it changes the shape of everything." "Clara, I know what people are saying," she said. She kept her voice even because she needed it even. "I've been a woman alone in working situations my entire life. I know exactly which lie is the most available one." She paused. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt, but I want you to understand what it is before you react to it. It's a strategy, not gossip, strategy." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "You know that." Clara felt heat come up in her face and was grateful she was near the stove, so it could be attributed to something else. "I'm practical," she said. "That too," he said. And then the lightness left his expression and he said, "I'm going to address this, directly, in public. I won't have your reputation. How you address it matters," Clara said. "If you go to town angry, it looks defensive. If you say too much about me, it looks like you're proving the point they're making." She looked at him. "Let me think about it. Give me until Sunday." He looked at her with that expression she still didn't entirely have a word for, the one that had started appearing more often, the one that made her careful with herself. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she said. He left. Clara turned back to the stove and stood there with her hands not quite doing what they were supposed to do, and told herself very firmly to think about the problem, and not about the way he'd said remarkable, and not about the thing she was feeling, and not about any of it, until there was time and space to feel it safely. What she came up with by Sunday was simple, not easy, but simple. The church. There was a Sunday service in town, a small congregation that met in the schoolhouse because there wasn't a proper church building yet, led by a traveling minister who came through every 2 weeks. It was the gathering point of the community, where people saw each other, where the social temperature of a place was most accurately read. Clara had not been to it since arriving. She hadn't gone into town at all since her arrival, except for a brief supply run with Hector 2 weeks back, where she had not stayed long enough for anyone to form much of an impression. She went to Nathaniel on Sunday morning before dawn. He was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and the spread of legal papers that had taken up permanent residence there. Greer's notes, the survey documents, the deed copy, the correspondence with the territorial office that had begun and had not yet produced anything. He looked up when she came in. "I need to go to Sunday service," Clara said, "and I'd like you to take me." He stared at her. "You want to walk in together?" he said slowly. "I want to walk in like what we are," Clara said. "An employer and his employee. Doing exactly what people do on Sunday morning in this territory, which is go to church. No hiding, no explanations, no defensiveness. Just ordinary. Because it is ordinary. And the best answer to a lie is making the truth so visible there's nowhere for the lie to stand." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "They're going to stare," he said. "Let them," Clara said. "Are you afraid of being stared at?" He looked at her. "No." "Then we'll go," she said. "Unless you think it's the wrong call." He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, turning it over the way he turned everything over properly, completely, without letting the answer he wanted interfere with the answer that was true. "It's the right call," he said. They rode into town in the buckboard with Walter and Cody in the back, which was also intentional, Clara had asked. And they had agreed, and so what pulled up to the schoolhouse on Sunday morning was not Nathaniel alone with Clara, which the rumor had already distorted in people's minds, but the four of them together in the ordinary configuration of a rancher and his people on a Sunday morning. The stairs started the moment they climbed down. Clara felt every single one of them. She had spent 25 years feeling exactly that kind of stare, the assessing, storytelling kind, the kind that had already decided what it was looking at before it had looked, and she had spent 25 years finding her footing under it. She found her footing under it now. She stood straight, and she walked with Nathaniel through the door of the schoolhouse, and she sat in the third row, because that was where there was space, and she kept her face in the peaceful, settled expression of someone who had nothing to explain and no intention of explaining it. The minister preached about community. Clara thought the irony was almost too neat to be accidental, but perhaps the territory had its own way of arranging such things. Afterward, in the gathering outside the schoolhouse, was when it happened. A woman named Helen Marsh, one of the pillars of whatever passed for society in the town, the wife of the man who ran the land office. A solid woman in her 50s with the air of someone accustomed to being the last word on things, came directly toward Clara with the confident stride of a woman who has decided to do something and is not going to be deflected from it. Clara prepared herself. Helen Marsh stopped in front of her and said, "Miss Whitmore, I've been meaning to get out to Black Pine to taste your cooking since the first week. I hear from reliable sources it's the best food in this territory." Clara blinked. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "It's not kindness, it's fact," Helen said briskly. "My husband's been saying for years that ranch needs someone who knows what they're doing in a kitchen. You're apparently what that looks like." She paused. "I also want you to know that whatever nonsense has been going around this week—" Her voice went flat and sharp at the same moment in the way of a woman who has decided that a thing needs to be called what it is. Most people in this town have more sense than to put stock in anything that comes out of Richard Holloway's sphere of influence. We know what he's doing and we know why. Clara looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh," she said. "Helen," the woman said, "come to supper at my house next week if you have an evening free. I want to hear about your work, and I want you to meet some people who might be useful to you." She glanced toward where Nathaniel was standing, talking to two men who appeared to be ranchers from the south end of the territory. "And to him. The man's had enough hard years. He deserves some good ones." She moved on with the efficiency of a woman with a schedule to keep. Clara stood where she was. Beside her, Walter said quietly, and with deep satisfaction, "Don't," Clara said. "Wasn't going to say a word," Walter said, looking pleased with the world in general. But the morning wasn't finished, because Richard Holloway was there. He arrived late as men who are used to making entrances arrive late, and he saw Nathaniel across the gathering, and he made his way over with the same pleasant, dangerous smile Clara had seen from the kitchen doorway. He had two men with him, not ranch hands, but the suited leather briefcase kind of men who made their living in rooms rather than on land. Clara watched from where she was standing with Walter. She watched Holloway approach Nathaniel, watched the exchange too far away to hear, but the shape of it clear. Holloway relaxed, genial, performing reasonableness for the audience around them. Nathaniel contained and straight-backed and very still the way he got when something in him had locked. Then Holloway said something that made Nathaniel go very still in a different way. And then Holloway looked past Nathaniel and found Clara with his eyes across the gathered crowd, and he held that look for just a moment long enough to make his point whatever his point was, and then looked back at Nathaniel and said something else, and smiled, and walked away. Nathaniel came to Clara directly. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the far-away thing, but it was a different kind of far-away, hotter, closer to the surface. "What did he say?" Clara said. "Not a question. He said—" Nathaniel stopped, breathed once. "He said he hoped I understood that the land matter could be resolved quietly, and to everyone's benefit if I was willing to discuss reasonable terms. And then he said—" Another stop. Nathaniel. "He said he hoped I was being careful about the kind of influence I allowed in my house. He said a man in my position couldn't afford to let sentiment cloud his business judgment." His voice had gone very controlled. "He was talking about you." Clara felt the words land the way she felt everything that was aimed at her all the way down past the armor, finding the places she hadn't managed to reinforce yet. She breathed. "He wants you angry," she said. "He wants you to do something here in front of people that he can use." "I know that," Nathaniel said, and his voice was tight with the effort of knowing it and feeling what he felt at the same time. "Then we walk to the buckboard," Clara said. "We say goodbye to Helen Marsh because she was kind and because it costs nothing and gains something. We drive back to the ranch, and we do what needs doing from a position of clarity instead of from anger." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You're very calm," he said. "No," Clara said quietly. "I'm angry. I'm angrier than you are probably because I've had a lifetime of practice knowing what it feels like when someone uses me as a weapon against someone She stopped. "Against someone who doesn't deserve it." She breathed. But I've also had a lifetime of practice knowing that acting from anger in front of men like Holloway is exactly what they want. So I breathe, and I do the next right thing, and I deal with how I actually feel somewhere private. Something shifted in Nathaniel's face. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, that particular look she didn't have a complete word for yet. "Let's say goodbye to Helen Marsh," he said. They did. They drove back to the ranch in the quiet that wasn't empty, the kind of quiet that's full of things people are thinking and not saying yet because the time isn't right and the words aren't ready. In that quiet, Clara sat in the buckboard with the Montana wind in her face, and the ridge coming closer, and she thought about what she'd almost said. Someone who doesn't deserve it. She'd been going to say something else, something true, that she wasn't ready to say out loud yet to him or to herself, or to the particular bright and dangerous feeling that had been building in her chest for weeks now, like water behind a dam that hadn't been built to hold this much. She breathed the cold air. She looked at the road. She told herself to be careful. But even careful had its limits, and Clara Whitmore was beginning to understand that some things, once they were in motion, did not stop for careful. They moved at their own pace and in their own direction, and all you could do was hold on and decide when the moment came whether you were going to run from them or let them carry you somewhere you hadn't known you were going. Back at the ranch after supper, after the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet, Nathaniel came back in. Clara was at the small table. The legal papers were there. He sat across from her and looked at the papers, and she looked at him, and the lamp made everything warm and close, and the Montana night pressed against the windows. "I think," Nathaniel said slowly, "that whatever Holloway does next is going to be bigger than a rumor." "I think so too," Clara said. "I think he's going to try to make it so that staying—" He paused. "Staying costs more than leaving, for both of us. That's how men like him work. They don't break things directly. They make the weight of holding on so heavy that people set it down." Clara looked at him steadily. "And if he does that," she said, "what are you going to do?" Nathaniel met her eyes. "I'm going to hold on," he said. "This is my land. These are my people." He paused. "And you're—" He stopped. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. "I'm your cook," Clara said carefully into the pause. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "among other things." Clara looked at the papers. Her heart was doing something she wasn't going to examine right now, at this table. In this light, with this man looking at her the way he was looking at her. "We should go through Greer's notes again," she said. "There was something in the 1879 survey description I wanted to look at more closely." "All right," Nathaniel said. And they bent their heads over the papers together, and they worked, and the lamp burned steady, and outside the Montana night went on being enormous and dark and full of everything that was still coming. The 1879 survey note that Clara had flagged turned out to matter more than either of them had realized that night at the kitchen table. It was a small thing. A footnote, almost a reference to a secondary boundary marker placed at the junction of the creek and a specific rock formation described in the surveyor's original language as the Great Split Stone at the water's bend, unmistakable in character, permanent in nature. Greer had glossed over it in his summary. The territorial office filing hadn't mentioned it at all. Holloway's false survey had simply omitted that marker's existence entirely, as if the split stone had never been documented. But it had been documented, in 1879, by a registered surveyor whose credentials were unimpeachable. And if that marker still stood where it had been placed, if the great split stone at the water's bend was still exactly where the 1879 document said it was, then Holloway's entire survey fell apart at the foundation, because you cannot redraw a boundary that is anchored to a permanent geological feature without explaining where that feature went. Nathaniel knew the stone. He told Clara about it the next morning, standing in the kitchen with his coffee and the survey document, and she watched his face change as he read the footnote again with new eyes, watched the locked-down anger shift into something sharper and more useful. "I've ridden past that stone 100 times," he said. "It's 40 yards inside what I've always understood as my land. which means it's 40 yards inside the boundary Holloway is trying to claim as his. Can you photograph it? Clara asked. Nathaniel looked up. What? There's a photographer in town. I've seen his sign. If you can get him out to that stone with his equipment and document exactly where it sits in relation to the creek and the boundary markers, that's something Greer can put in front of the territorial office that's harder to argue with than survey language. Nathaniel stared at her. He stopped. Yes, that's exactly right. He set his cup down. I'll send Pete into town this morning. Send Cody, Clara said. Pete talks too much when he's excited. Cody keeps things close. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment with that expression again. Cody, he said. Cody. Clara confirmed and turned back to the stove. She heard him go to find the boy, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of quiet satisfaction before returning to the business of breakfast. Cody came back from town with the photographer confirmed for Wednesday. He also came back with something else. Something in his face when he walked through the kitchen door that Clara read before he said a word. What happened in town? She said. Cody set down the package he'd been sent for lamp oil and a length of cord, and he stood with his hands at his sides and said, Aldous is in town. The name landed like a stone in still water. Aldous. The surveyor Greer had identified as the man who'd done Holloway's flexible work for flexible money. The man whose false survey was the entire legal basis of Holloway's claim. Where? Clara said. At the hotel? Cody said. He was at the general store when I went in, talking to Mr. Granger, who runs the place. I heard him say, Cody hesitated. He was talking about Black Pine. Said the ranch had been mismanaged since Mrs. Brooks died, and that it was a shame good land was being wasted on sentiment. He paused. And then he said a man who let his household be run by someone like you wasn't fit to make sound decisions about property. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara kept her hands moving, kept her face still. He used my name, she asked. No, ma'am, Cody said, and his jaw was tight with a fury he was clearly working to contain. He didn't need to. Clara absorbed that. Thank you for telling me, she said. What are we going to do? Cody said, and the we came out of him naturally, without deliberation. The way it had started coming from all of them, this boy who had arrived at Black Pine with nothing, and had slowly over weeks found a shape for himself inside the life of this place. Clara looked at him. We're going to do exactly what we planned. Photographer on Wednesday. Greer reviews the Splitstone documentation. We let the truth do what the truth does when it's properly presented. She paused. And Cody, don't tell the men about Aldous yet. Not Ethan especially. I need everyone thinking clearly, and Ethan's not at his most rational when he's angry on someone else's behalf. Cody almost smiled at that. No, ma'am. Go eat something, Clara said. You rode fast. You need it. He did. And Clara turned back to her work and thought about Aldous in the hotel in town, and what it meant that Holloway had brought him in person, and she concluded that it meant Holloway was getting ready to move. Not the slow pressure of rumor and legal maneuver that had characterized the past weeks. Something more direct, something faster. She thought about what Walter had said, that Holloway's method was to make the weight of holding on too heavy to bear. She thought about what that weight might look like when it arrived at full force. She thought about whether Black Pine could bear it. And then she stopped thinking about it because supper needed managing, and thinking without acting was just a way of frightening yourself. And Clara Whitmore had decided a long time ago that she would not spend her energy frightening herself when there was work to be done. Nathaniel found out about Aldous from Walter. Clara had told Walter because Walter needed to know and had trusted his judgment about what to do with the information, and his judgment had been to tell Nathaniel directly and quietly before supper, rather than let it surface in front of the men. Nathaniel came to the kitchen before the men filed in for the evening meal, and he stood in the doorway, and he looked at Clara and said, "You already knew." "Since this afternoon," she said. "You didn't tell me." "I needed to think before I told you, and I needed to finish supper." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you now through Walter, which is the same as telling you." He was quiet for a moment. Not angry processing. She had learned the difference. He's here to be visible, Nathaniel said. Aldous, Holloway wants people to see that he's brought in his surveyor, wants the town to understand that this is getting more serious. Yes, Clara said. He's showing his pieces on the board. Then we show ours, Nathaniel said. Wednesday, Clara said. We show ours Wednesday when the photographer comes and we have something real to put in front of people. Until then we don't react, we don't engage. We cook supper and we work the ranch and we give him nothing to use. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. How are you this steady? He asked. And it wasn't the same as when he'd said she was calm outside the church. This was different, more personal, more direct. Clara looked back at him and chose honesty over deflection for once. I'm not steady, she said quietly. I'm choosing to act steady because the alternative doesn't help. There's a difference. She paused. My mother used to say the ground doesn't feel solid because nothing is moving. It feels solid because you keep your weight on it. Nathaniel held her eyes. Keep your weight on it, he repeated. Every single day, Clara said. He nodded once. Then he went to the dining room, and Clara served supper, and the evening passed the way evenings had been passing at Black Pine lately, with noise and food, and the particular warmth of people who had stopped being strangers to each other. But underneath the pressure was building. Everyone felt it without discussing it the way animals feel weather, without having language for what's coming. Wednesday arrived gray and cold for July, which was unusual enough that the men remarked on it, and Clara thought that the weather had a sense of drama, even if she wasn't supposed to describe it. The photographer, a young man named David Pierce with careful eyes and efficient hands who turned out to be competent in a way that inspired confidence, arrived at the ranch at 8 in the morning, and Nathaniel took him out to the western pasture with Walter and Cody, while Clara stayed at the ranch. Ethan Cole came to find her at 10. He leaned in the kitchen doorway, not holding his hat. This time, this was a different kind of visit. His expression was the practical, stripped-down one he wore when he'd made a decision and was acting on it. I want to tell you something, he said. All right, Clara said. Aldous came out to the ranch line yesterday afternoon, he said. Clara went still. What? I didn't say anything because I was figuring out what I'd seen before I brought it to anyone. His jaw set. He rode along the creek line, stayed on the public access side technically. But he had a notebook. He was writing things down. Did he speak to anyone? He saw me, Ethan said. Pulled up about 50 yards from the fence, looked at me. Then he wrote something in his notebook and rode back toward town. A pause. The way he looked at me, it wasn't curiosity. It was like he was noting a detail, like I was part of something he was already planning. Clara felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. You need to tell Nathaniel the moment he gets back, she said. I know, Ethan said. I'm telling you first because you'll know how to tell him so he doesn't go into town and do something that costs him. Clara looked at Ethan Cole, this man who had mocked her the first day, who had carried his contempt like a shield, who had apologized with difficulty and meant it, and since then become something she hadn't anticipated. Not just civil. Actively protective. In the particular way of men who, once they've decided something is worth defending, defend it with everything they have. Thank you, Ethan, she said. Don't thank me, he said gruffly, which was apparently what the men of Black Pine Ranch said when they'd done something decent and didn't know how to receive gratitude for it. Just make sure he doesn't do anything stupid. I'll do my best, Clara said. Ethan left and Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the counter in thought. Aldous riding the creek line and taking notes meant the next move was about the physical boundary, which meant Holloway was preparing to make a formal challenge to the markers, possibly to claim that the original markers had been incorrectly placed, or had shifted, or could not be definitively identified. The split stone. If they could document the split stone clearly and completely before Holloway made his formal challenge, they would be ahead of him by one step. One step was enough. One step in this kind of fight was sometimes everything. She had the midday meal waiting when Nathaniel, Walter, and Cody came back from the western pasture. She could see from the way they walked, Nathaniel in particular, that something had gone right. Nathaniel came into the kitchen before he'd even taken his coat off. "The stone is exactly where the survey says it is," he said. "Pierce photographed it from 3 angles with the creek visible and the original boundary post in frame. He also photographed the second marker post and the specific rock formation the 1879 document describes as the eastern reference point." He pulled out a small piece of paper, his own notes from the morning. "Everything matches. Everything." Clara felt the tight thing in her chest release a fraction. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed, and for just a moment he smiled. Not the managed, careful expression she usually saw from him, but something real and unguarded and younger than he usually let himself appear, and Clara looked away from it because she needed to. Then she told him about Aldous and the creek line. The smile went. She watched him go through it. The controlled anger, the calculation, the same process she'd seen before when he was managing something that could be damaging if he let it drive him. "He was taking notes of the markers," Nathaniel said. "That's what Ethan believes," Clara said. Ethan was watching him carefully. He's sure the man had a specific interest in the creek boundary. "Then he's preparing to challenge the physical markers," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Clara said, "which means we need Greer to file the photographic documentation before Holloway makes his formal move. If the challenge comes first, we're defending. If our documentation is already filed, we're established." "I'll wire Greer today," Nathaniel said. "Wire him the moment after you eat," Clara said. "Pierce needs to develop the photographs first. How long did he say? 2 days. Then wire Greer that documentation will be with him by Friday, and that he needs to be ready to file immediately upon receipt." Clara held his eyes. "Don't give Holloway the weekend to move first." Nathaniel looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Yes. If I didn't have you—" He stopped, looked at the wall, looked back at her. "This ranch would already be gone. I want you to understand that. Not the cooking, not the morale. This." He gestured at the paper between them. "This thinking, this—" He shook his head slightly. "You would have figured it out," Clara said. "Maybe," he said. "Eventually, after he'd won." He paused. "You don't have to minimize what you're doing. I notice it. I've been noticing it for weeks and I haven't—" He stopped again. Something in him was struggling with something the way people struggle when they've been self-contained for so long that saying true things out loud has become difficult. Clara waited. "I haven't said enough of what I should say," he finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara felt the dam in her chest straining against something vast. "Eat your lunch," she said, "and then go wire Greer." He ate. He wired Greer, and he rode out to manage the afternoon's ranch work, and Clara washed the dishes and told the dam to hold a little longer. It held. Barely. The photographs came back from Pierce on Friday morning, delivered by Cody, who had ridden in to collect them before dawn. Clara was in the kitchen when Cody came through the door with the envelope, and she could see from his face that he'd already looked. "Are they good?" she asked. "They're perfect," Cody said, and his voice had something in it she'd rarely heard from him, a kind of fierce, quiet joy. "You can see everything. The stone, the creek, the posts. It's all exactly right." Nathaniel took them to the telegraph office himself that afternoon and wired Greer that the documentation was being dispatched by the Friday afternoon mail. Clara stayed at the ranch. She made supper and set the table, and when the men came in that evening, there was something different in the air. A loosening, a collective exhale, the particular relief of people who have been waiting for something to go right and have watched it cautiously begin to go right. Walter raised his coffee cup at the end of supper and said to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, to doing the right thing in the right order. Nobody explained it. They didn't need to. They all lifted whatever they were holding, and the toast was made, and Clara, who was in the kitchen doorway with her own cup, lifted hers too. Nathaniel looked at her from the head of the table, and then he looked away first, which was unusual enough that Clara noticed. The twist came on Saturday. It came in the form of a letter, a formal letter on the letterhead of a legal firm in Helena, delivered to Black Pine Ranch by a rider who arrived at 10 in the morning and handed it to Nathaniel at the barn door without speaking, and rode away again. Nathaniel read it standing in the yard. Clara saw his face from the kitchen window, and she set down what she was holding and went out. He handed it to her without a word. She read it. Holloway wasn't challenging the boundary markers. He had moved past that entirely to something that made the survey dispute look like a preliminary. He was claiming that the original deed to Black Pine Ranch, the deed that had established the property in 1874, before Nathaniel's ownership, under the name of the man Nathaniel had bought it from, contained a fraudulent land grant. He was claiming that the original grant had been issued in error by a territorial official who had since been removed from his position for corruption. He was claiming that if the original grant was void, then all subsequent ownership was void. He was claiming in the careful language of lawyers who knew exactly what they were doing that Black Pine Ranch did not legally belong to Nathaniel Brooks at all, that it had effectively never legally belonged to anyone with a valid deed, and that as the adjacent landowner with the longest-standing presence in the territory, Richard Holloway intended to file a claim for the property under territorial homestead law. Clara read it twice. She handed it back to Nathaniel. He was looking at the mountains. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working at the back of it. "This is different," she said. "Yes," he said. "This isn't about the western pasture anymore." "No," he said. "It's about everything." The men found out within an hour. Not because Nathaniel gathered them and told them he hadn't decided yet how to say it, but because Frank had been near the barn when the rider came, and Frank had a face that didn't hide things well. And by the time Nathaniel had read the letter twice, and Clara had read it once, and they had stood in the yard working through the first shock of it, the men knew something had happened and were waiting in the specific tense stillness of people who understand that what's coming is significant. Nathaniel told them at midday. He stood in the dining room doorway before Clara served the meal, and he told them straight without softening it, because these men had earned the truth, and he knew it. The room went very quiet. Then Ethan Cole said, "He can't actually do this." "He's trying to," Nathaniel said. "Can he win?" Pete asked. "Greer says—" Nathaniel stopped. "I don't know yet. I need to talk to Greer." "Then talk to Greer today," Ethan said. "Not Monday. Today." Nathaniel nodded. What happened next was something Clara would remember for a long time, because it happened without orchestration or planning, or anyone deciding it should happen. Ethan Cole stood up from the table. He looked at the men around him. "I don't know the law," he said. "I know cattle, and I know fence line, and I know that this ranch is the best situation I've had in 8 years of working other men's land." He paused. "I don't intend to work somewhere else because Richard Holloway decided he wanted what somebody else built." He looked at Nathaniel. "Whatever you need from us, whatever that looks like, you have it." Around the table, one by one, the men nodded. Walter, Frank, Pete, Hector, Cody fiercely and without hesitation. Nathaniel looked at them, and Clara, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw something happen in his face that she had not seen before. A fracture in the composure quickly controlled the kind of thing that happens to a man when he has spent so long believing himself fundamentally alone that evidence to the contrary is almost too large to process. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said. It came out rougher than he'd intended. "All of you." He caught Clara's eyes from across the room. She looked at him steadily. He nodded once very slightly, and she nodded back, and it was the kind of exchange that carries a great deal more than what it appears to carry on its surface. Nathaniel rode to town to wire Greer. Clara ran the kitchen and told herself to focus on the work in front of her, and stopped herself from tracking the clock against when he might return. She was mostly successful. He came back at 4. Greer had responded within the hour the lawyer had been expecting something like this. He said because men like Holloway did not give up on things they wanted, and when the survey strategy began to fail, they escalated. The original land grant was the kind of thing that could theoretically be challenged if you had the right corruption angle to pursue. But Greer said The territorial official in question, the one Holloway was claiming had issued the grant in error, had been removed for taking bribes in mining claims, not land grants. A different category of corruption. Greer said the connection was thin and would require Holloway to prove a specific link that probably didn't exist. Probably, Clara said when Nathaniel told her this. They were in the kitchen, which had become the place where the serious conversations happened without either of them having decided that was what it was. That word is doing a lot of work. I know, Nathaniel said. He sat heavily in the chair at the small table. Greer thinks we're solid. He thinks Holloway is overreaching and that the territorial court will see it that way. He looked at his hands. He also said that Holloway's lawyers are very good and that the hearing, if it comes to a hearing, will not be fast. How long? Clara asked. Months. Could be into winter. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised her as she said it, because she hadn't known she'd decided it until the words were out. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Nathaniel looked up at her. This is... She stopped. Started again. This ranch matters to me. These people matter to me. She held his gaze careful and direct. I don't have a stake in it the way you do. I know that. But whatever this takes, for as long as it takes, I'm here. The kitchen was very still. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Clara had to work to hold the steadiness in her face, while the dam in her chest did something complicated and enormous. I know, he said quietly. I know you are. And then he said, Can I ask you something? Yes, she said. He looked at the table, at his hands, then at her directly, with the unguarded quality she'd only seen from him in small doses carefully rationed, as if he had a limited supply of it and was protective of where it went. When this is over, he said, when this is settled one way or the other, what did you want before you came here? Before Black Pine? He paused. What did Clara Whitmore want for herself? The question landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to land. She looked at him. I wanted to cook, she said, but not just as a job. I wanted... She stopped, looked at the surface of the table. I wanted to cook for somewhere that felt like mine, not owned, not legally. Just mine in the way things are yours when you've given yourself to them, and they've held you in return. She paused. I never had that. Not once, he said quietly. Not once, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. This kitchen, he said. It's yours. That was true the day I said it, and it's more true now. He paused. And this ranch. He stopped. Something in him was deciding something. You're not an employee here, Clara. You haven't been for a long time. I don't know the right word for what you are, but it's not that. Clara's heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. Nathaniel, she said carefully. I'm not saying it right, he said. I know I'm not saying it right. I'm better with land surveys and cattle counts than I am with... He gestured, slightly frustrated with himself. I've been alone for 5 years, and I forgot how to say things that matter without turning them into something that sounds like a business arrangement. Clara looked at him. You're saying it fine, she said. And her voice came out softer than she'd intended. Softer than was careful. Softer than the carefully maintained distance she'd been keeping between what she felt and what she showed. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the lamp on the table was burning low, because neither of them had thought to trim it, and somewhere outside a horse moved in the barn, and the Montana night was enormous and dark and pressing against the windows. I don't want to make it this complicated, Nathaniel said. You've got enough complicated right now without me adding to it. You're not adding to it, Clara said before she'd decided to say it. He went still. No, he said. No, she said. They looked at each other across the small table, with the legal papers between them, and the lamp burning low, and the whole complicated, dangerous, uncertain situation of Black Pine Ranch around them. And what was happening between them was not complicated in the way the ranch was complicated. It was simple, in the way things are simple, when they are true, not easy, not uncomplicated in terms of what it might mean, and what it might require. But true, the way the split stone at the creek was true. It was there. It had always been there. No amount of flexible surveying was going to move it. Clara broke it first because she was the more cautious one, and because being cautious was a habit formed over 25 years that didn't yield easily, even to this. "The hearing," she said. "When Greer thinks it will be—" "Clara?" Nathaniel said. "Nathaniel," she said back in the same tone. He looked at her. She looked at him. "After," she said quietly. "When this is settled, you can say the thing you're trying to say. I'll be here to hear it." Something moved in his face, relief possibly, or the particular emotion of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been told he can set it down temporarily, which is not the same as setting it down permanently, but is enough for now. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He went to bed. Clara stayed in the kitchen and trimmed the lamp because it needed it, and she needed something to do with her hands. And she thought about after, and what after might look like, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 25 years of hard roads and bad kitchens and people who decided they knew everything about her before she'd said her name. She felt like someone who was going to get to stay. She didn't trust it fully yet. She might not trust it fully for a long time. That was the honest truth of who she was. Cautious, careful, built from years of hoping and being wrong about hope. But she felt it. And she held on to it, the way you hold on to the one thing you've decided to believe in when everything else is uncertain. The way you keep your weight on the ground, every single day. Greer arrived at Black Pine on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the letter riding hard from Helena, with his briefcase and his wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular controlled urgency of a man who has spent the weekend working and has news that cannot wait for pleasantries. Clara had breakfast on the table when he walked through the door. She did not know he was coming. Nathaniel had received the wire Saturday evening and had not told her she suspected, because he wanted to know what it contained before he had to explain it to anyone else. But when Greer sat down at the kitchen table and Nathaniel sat across from him, and neither of them made a move toward the dining room, Clara understood that she was meant to be there, and she poured the coffee and she sat. Greer looked at her once briefly with the assessing eyes of a man accustomed to reading rooms. Then he opened his briefcase. "The Territorial Court has accepted the photographic documentation," he said. "The survey challenged the original western boundary dispute has been dismissed. The photographs in combination with the 1879 survey language are sufficient. That part is over." Clara felt the first knot in her chest release. "The deed challenge is different," Greer continued, because he was the kind of lawyer who delivered good news and bad news in the same breath to prevent the good from becoming a distraction from what mattered. Holloway's claim regarding the original land grant is not frivolous on its face. The official he's referencing, Caldwell, was removed in 1881 for corrupt practice. The question is whether any of the land grants he issued in his tenure were affected by that corruption. "Were they?" Nathaniel said. "The territorial investigation in 1881 identified 12 specific grants that Caldwell issued improperly took bribes for altered boundaries on or created from fraudulent surveys." Greer looked at him. "The Black Pine grant is not on that list." "Then the challenge fails," Nathaniel said. "The challenge should fail," Greer said carefully. "Holloway's lawyers are going to argue that the investigation was incomplete, that Caldwell's corruption was broader than the 12 identified cases. They're going to argue that the absence of Black Pine from the list doesn't mean the grant was clean, it means the investigation didn't look hard enough." The kitchen was quiet. "Can they prove that?" Clara asked. Greer looked at her. "They don't need to prove it in full. They only need to create sufficient doubt to get a hearing. And if they get a hearing—" He paused. "Hearings take time. They cost money. They create uncertainty. And uncertainty in a property dispute of this kind affects everything connected to the property. Buyers for your cattle become cautious. Suppliers become cautious. Banks certainly become cautious." He folded his hands on the table. That may be what Holloway is actually after. Not the land. The disruption. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at the table. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down, looked at Greer. "What do we need?" he said. "Evidence," Greer said. "Specific documentary evidence that the Black Pine grant was issued cleanly. Ideally, something that shows Caldwell's involvement with this particular grant was routine standard processing, no irregularities, no money changing hands outside the official fee." He paused. "The Territorial Archive in Helena has Caldwell's office records from his tenure. I've requested access, but the archive is—" He chose his word carefully. "Slow." "How slow?" Clara said. "Weeks, possibly longer. The archivist is a thorough man who does not respond well to urgency." Clara thought. "What was Caldwell's territory?" she said. "Geographically, what areas did his office cover?" Greer looked at her. "This county, 3 adjacent counties to the east, and the mining districts in the north." He paused. "Why?" "Because if his corruption was primarily in the mining districts," Clara said. "The land grants in this county are more likely to be clean," Greer finished. He looked at her with an expression that was the lawyer's version of respect, which was subtler than most people's but legible if you were paying attention. "Yes, exactly. And there is some evidence for that. 7 of the 12 identified corrupt grants were in the northern mining districts. Only 2 were in this county, and neither was a ranch grant. They were both town lot sales." He paused. "That's an argument. It's not proof, but it's an argument." "Then make it," Clara said. "While the archive is being slow, make that argument to whoever needs to hear it. Establish the pattern of where his corruption operated. Make Holloway's lawyers prove that a man whose corruption was demonstrably concentrated in the mining districts somehow extended it to routine ranch grants in a county he wasn't being paid to manipulate." Greer was very still for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "Where did you find her?" "She walked through my gate," Nathaniel said, and his voice had something warm in it that he didn't appear to be trying to manage. Greer looked back at Clara. "You've been reading the documents." "I've been listening," Clara said, "and asking questions, and thinking at night when the kitchen is quiet." "You should have been a lawyer," Greer said. "I'm a cook," Clara said, "which is better in my opinion because lawyers go home hungry." She stood up and refilled his coffee. "When can you file the pattern argument?" "Wednesday," Greer said. "If I start today?" "Then start today," Clara said. "And if you need the kitchen table, the legal papers are already here." Greer stayed until Thursday. He worked at the kitchen table because that was where the papers were, as Clara had said, and because the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was continuous, and Clara kept food appearing at intervals that seemed to anticipate exactly when a person needed to stop thinking and put something in their body before they thought themselves past the point of usefulness. On the second day, Greer looked up from his papers in the late afternoon and said unprompted, "You know what this case needs that it doesn't have yet?" "Tell me," Clara said without stopping what she was doing. "A witness," Greer said. "Someone who had dealings with Caldwell's office during his tenure. Someone who can testify that the Black Pine grant processing was ordinary. A clerk, an assistant, someone who worked in or adjacent to that office, and can say what the routine looked like." He paused. "Caldwell died in 1883. His immediate staff are either dead or gone from the territory. But someone who had business with that office, who went in for a routine land grant, and can describe what the process looked like, what was asked of them, whether there were irregularities, that person, if they still exist and can be found, would be very useful." Clara thought about that. She thought about it while she finished the afternoon's prep, and she thought about it while she served supper, and she thought about it while she was washing the dishes in the quiet kitchen after the men had gone. She was drying a pot when it came to her. She set the pot down. She went to find Walter. He was on the porch, the way he sometimes was in the evenings, sitting in the chair he had claimed by long use, looking at the dark, in the particular companionable way of old men who have made their peace with silence. "Walter," Clara said, "how long have you been in this territory?" 31 years. Walter said without particular inflection, as if 31 years were neither remarkable nor small. "Were you here when Black Pine was granted?" she said. "In 1874. Walter turned his head and looked at her. "I was working a ranch south of here in 74, he said slowly. "The Kellerman place. Old Kellerman took out a grazing expansion grant the same year the Black Pine grant was issued." He paused. "Same office, same process." Clara held very still. "Same official," she said. "Caldwell's office, yes," Walter said. He was watching her with those steady eyes. "We went in together, old Kellerman, and the man who sold this place to Nathaniel later. I remember because Kellerman made a joke about how the two of them were getting their paper on the same day, and it must mean they were meant to be neighbors." He paused. "I was there, in the office. I remember what it looked like." Clara sat down on the porch step. "Walter," she said, "would you be willing to say that to Greer? To say it formally in writing in a way he could use in the hearing, if it comes to one?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. "I'd be willing," he said, "to tell the truth about what I saw, which is that it was the most ordinary thing I've ever been in a government office for. They paid the fee, they signed the paper, the clerk stamped it, and we all went home." He paused. "Nothing passed between anybody except the official fee. I'd stake my word on it." "Your word is exactly what Greer needs," Clara said. Walter looked at the dark for a moment. "Go get the lawyer," he said. Clara went and got the lawyer. Greer sat with Walter for 2 hours that night, and when he came back to the kitchen, his expression was the contained, precise version of satisfied that a careful man allows himself when something has gone genuinely right. "That," he said to Clara, "is exactly what this case needed." "I know," Clara said, and handed him a plate because it was past 9 and he hadn't eaten since noon, and brilliant legal strategy was no use to anyone who had fainted from hunger. He laughed a small, real laugh that surprised them both. The filing went in on Thursday afternoon. The pattern argument. Walter's witness statement, the photographic documentation already on record. Greer's analysis of Caldwell's documented corruption as geographically and categorically distinct from routine ranch grants, all of it together, assembled into the kind of legal response that told a clear story to anyone willing to read it. Holloway's lawyers had 10 days to respond. Those 10 days at Black Pine were the strangest Clara had experienced since arriving. The work continued. It always continued, cattle and feed and fence line, and the endless practical business of a working ranch, but everything had a quality of waiting underneath it, of held breath. Clara cooked. She cooked the way she always cooked, fully, and without holding back, because the kitchen was hers, and the people at the table were hers, in the way she had never had people be hers before, and she was not going to let the waiting make her smaller. On the 5th day of the 10, Helen Marsh came to the ranch. She rode out herself, which apparently surprised everyone except Clara, who had taken the measure of Helen Marsh at the church steps, and found a woman who did things she decided to do without requiring an audience for the decision. She came into the kitchen and sat down and accepted coffee, and looked at Clara with the direct practical gaze that was her characteristic. "I want you to know what people are saying in town," she said. "Good or bad?" Clara said. "Mostly good," Helen said. Greer's filing has been seen by enough people who understand what it says that the general view is shifting. People who were waiting to see which way this went are starting to decide. She paused. "Holloway has friends in this town, but he has them the way men of his kind always have friends, because people are afraid of him or indebted to him or both. That kind of friendship has limits." She looked at her cup. When people think the other side is going to win, those limits become apparent very quickly. "You think we're going to win," Clara said. "I think you've made it very hard for anyone to justify helping Holloway win," Helen said, which was the precise, careful version of the same thing. She paused. "I also think that what you've done here—" She looked around the kitchen and then at Clara directly. "What you've done for this ranch, for these men, for Nathaniel." She stopped. "I knew his wife, Margaret. She was a good woman, and she would have—" Helen stopped again, cleared her throat in the way of someone who has unexpectedly moved themselves. "She would have liked you a great deal," she finished. Clara felt something go very quiet and very warm inside her at exactly the same moment. "Thank you, Helen," she said. "Don't thank me," Helen said, which apparently was contagious in this territory. "Just keep feeding people." She finished her coffee and rode back to town, and Clara stood in the kitchen for a long moment after she left, feeling things she wasn't going to name right now in the middle of the day, with supper to prepare. She prepared supper. On the 8th day, Holloway came. Not his lawyers, not a rider with a letter. Holloway himself in his wagon with his expensive hat and his 2 horseback men, and he pulled up to the main house in the middle of the morning when most of the ranch hands were out on the property and only Clara and Cody were near the house. Clara heard the wagon and came to the kitchen door. Nathaniel came out of the barn. They met in the yard at the same moment, and Clara stayed in the doorway because this was Nathaniel's ground and Nathaniel's confrontation, and she was not going to step into it uninvited. But she did not go back inside. Holloway climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried ease of a man who believes time is on his side. "Nathaniel," he said, "I'd like to talk." "We're talking through lawyers," Nathaniel said. "I'd rather talk like neighbors," Holloway said. "Man to man, without the legal language in the way." Nathaniel said nothing. He waited. Holloway looked around the yard. His eyes found Clara in the kitchen doorway and stayed there for a moment, in that same assessing, dismissive way, and then something shifted in his expression. A recalibration. She had been a background detail the first time he'd seen her, and the second. Now she was something else. She could see him adjusting his understanding of the situation. He looked back at Nathaniel. "Your lawyer is good," he said. "I'll give you that. The pattern argument is clever, and the witness is inconvenient." He paused as if granting a point in a negotiation. "But you know and I know that hearings are expensive and slow and uncertain. And you know and I know that this kind of uncertainty is hard on a working operation." He spread his hands in the gesture of a reasonable man. "I'm offering you a way out that lets you keep what you've built and frees you from what's coming." "What are you offering?" Nathaniel said flatly. "The western pasture," Holloway said. 40 acres along the creek boundary. You grant me clear title to those 40 acres, I withdraw my filing. All of it. The deed challenge, the survey dispute, everything. Clean." He paused. "You keep the rest. You keep your operation. You keep..." His eyes moved toward the kitchen doorway again just briefly. "You keep your household arrangements exactly as they are. No one examines anything further. Everyone moves on." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. The Montana sky above them was enormous and blue and completely indifferent. Nathaniel looked at Holloway for a long moment. "The 40 acres along the creek," he said. "That's the water." "It's just land," Holloway said pleasantly. "It's the water that feeds the western pasture," Nathaniel said. "Without it, I lose the pasture. Without the pasture, I lose a third of my grazing. Without the grazing..." He stopped. "You know exactly what you're asking for. You've always known, and you're asking me to give it to you willingly and thank you for the privilege of keeping the rest." Holloway was still pleasantly arranged on his face, but something behind it had shifted. "I'm offering you certainty," he said. "That's worth something." "I have certainty," Nathaniel said. "I have a deed and a survey and a witness and a lawyer who has made it very clear that your case is built on the assumption that I'll exhaust before it goes to a full hearing." He paused. "I won't." "Nathaniel." "I want you off my property," Nathaniel said. "Now." Holloway looked at him. The pleasant arrangement on his face had settled into something else, not anger exactly. More like a man reassessing a calculation he'd thought was settled. He looked at the kitchen doorway again. At Clara. "Interesting times for a ranch cook to have this much influence over a man's decisions," he said. Not to Nathaniel. To the air in a voice designed to carry, designed to land where it was aimed. Clara felt it land. She stepped out of the doorway. Not far, just enough. "Mr. Holloway," she said. He looked at her. "I run this kitchen," she said. "I manage supplies and I train staff and I make sure 12 men are fed 3 times a day, 7 days a week." I also, as it happens, read documents carefully and ask questions and think about problems until I understand them. She held his eyes. That's not influence. That's competence. And the fact that you're standing in this yard trying to use me as a way to embarrass Nathaniel into compliance tells me everything I need to know about how your case actually looks from your side. Holloway stared at her. Cody had appeared at the corner of the barn without Clara noticing him come. Frank and Hector were at the fence line. She could see them moving closer. Pete was somewhere behind her. She could hear his footsteps on the porch. Ethan Cole came around the far side of the barn. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his hat on and his arms at his sides in the particular stance of a man who has positioned himself where he intends to stay. And then Walter came from wherever Walter had been, and he stood. Holloway looked around at all of them. Something changed in his face. Not defeat, not yet. But the look of a man whose calculation has failed to account for a significant variable. He looked at Nathaniel. "We'll let the courts decide," he said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "We will." Holloway climbed back onto his wagon. He tipped his expensive hat, not warmly, and he drove away, and the dust of the road rose behind him and settled. The yard was very quiet. Then Pete Garland said from the porch with the gap-toothed grin that had come back to his face in the weeks since Clara arrived, "Reckon that went about as well as it could." The tension in the yard broke. Ethan made a sound that was an actual laugh, short and real, and the kind of laugh that comes out of relief finding an exit. Cody looked at Clara with his fierce, quiet eyes. Nathaniel turned to face her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her lately, with the thing he hadn't said yet, the thing he'd said he would say after. She looked back at him and felt everything she'd been holding very carefully for months, pressing at the carefully maintained interior of herself, with a force that was getting harder to manage. "Go eat," Clara said to the yard in general. "All of you. I had biscuits ready an hour ago and they're getting cold." There was a general movement toward the kitchen, and Clara went ahead of them to manage the serving, and because she needed something to do with her hands before she did something that wasn't careful. Nathaniel came in last. He sat at the small table and waited until the men had taken their food and gone to the dining room, waited until the kitchen was theirs, the way it had become theirs in the past months. Not only her space or only his house, but something between those two things. A place that belonged to both of them, in the way things belong to people who have shared them through difficulty. He looked at her. "After," he said quietly. She looked back at him. "After," she confirmed. The hearing came 6 weeks later, September, when the Montana air had gone sharp, and the light had that particular quality of a season changing still bright, but with an edge to it, like something beautiful reminding you that it is temporary. Greer presented. Nathaniel attended. Walter went as the witness, which he did with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything straightforwardly, without dramatics, saying exactly what he had seen, and remembering it with the precision of a man who has always known that accuracy is a form of respect for the truth. Clara stayed at the ranch. She was not a legal party. She was not a witness. She had done what she could do, and now the thing was in other hands, the way things eventually have to be when you have done your part and the next part belongs to someone else. She cooked. She made a proper supper, the best she had careful, and complete the kind of meal that required hours, and everything she knew, because she needed her hands occupied, and because if this was the last night, or if it was the first night of something new, she wanted the table to be right either way. Cody helped. He moved through the kitchen with the quiet ease of someone who has learned a place so thoroughly that being in it is its own kind of rest. He didn't talk much because Cody never talked much, but twice he said things to Clara that were observations about the cooking that were exact and correct, and Clara felt something that was very close to pride and did not attempt to suppress it. "You've learned a lot," she said. Cody looked at the stove. "You've taught a lot," he said. "What will you do," Clara said, "when you're not 16 anymore, when you're ready for your own something?" Cody thought about this seriously, the way he thought about most things. "Cook," he said. "Maybe my own place one day. Somewhere people need feeding." He paused. "Like this. But mine." Clara looked at him. "That's a good thing to want," she said. "You taught me it was possible," he said simply, and went back to the stove, and Clara had to look away for a moment and pretend to be very occupied with something in the pantry. Nathaniel came back at 4 in the afternoon. Clara heard the horses and came to the kitchen door, and she read his face from across the yard before he reached her, and what she read made something enormous and exhaled in her chest move. He was smiling. Not managed, not contained. A real smile. The kind she had only seen from him twice before. Once briefly over the photograph documentation, once on the porch with his coffee on an ordinary morning, 3 weeks back, when something Cody had said had caught him off guard. He came through the kitchen door, and he stood in front of her, and he said, "Dismissed, full dismissal. The court found the deed challenge without sufficient foundation and issued a formal ruling that the Black Pine land grant is valid and uncontested." He paused. "Holloway's lawyers have 30 days to appeal, but Greer says they won't. There's nothing to appeal with. It's over." Clara stood very still. She breathed. She felt the thing she'd been holding for months, the constant braced readiness, the careful management of hope, the deliberate distance she'd kept between herself and the belief that this could actually end well. She felt it release all of it, the entire accumulated weight of it. And the release was so complete and sudden that she had to put her hand on the counter to keep herself exactly where she was. "Over," she said. "Over," he said. And then because Nathaniel Brooks was a man who had told her he was better with land surveys and cattle counts than with saying things that mattered, and who had spent 6 weeks proving that wrong by saying more true things to Clara Whitmore than she'd had said to her in the preceding 25 years, he said, "I told you I'd say it after." Clara looked at him. "You did," she said. "It's after," he said. "It is," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen. The kitchen with the fixed flue, and the rehung cabinet doors, and the pantry that was properly stocked, and the small table where they had worked through legal papers and hard nights, and the careful incremental process of two people discovering each other. And he said it. He said, "I love you, Clara Whitmore." He said it the way he said things that were true, plainly without flourish, in the voice he used when he was done managing, and had decided to just be honest. He said it like the fact it was. Clara felt it move through her, the way the first meal on that first night had moved through the men at the table. Finding the hungry places, the places that had been unfed for so long they'd stopped expecting to be fed. She felt it go all the way down. She had spent 25 years being told in the language of stares and laughter and sideways cruelty and turned away jobs and every room she'd walked into and seen people decide they knew what she was worth before she'd opened her mouth. She had spent 25 years being told that she was too much. Too large, too different, too unbelievable as the kind of person someone could want. She looked at this man who had given her one supper, and then given her the kitchen, and then gradually and honestly given her something she had no practice receiving. "I love you too," she said. And her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Because she was Clara Whitmore, and she had been steady through everything, and this was not a thing to fall apart for. This was a thing to stand in fully with her weight on the ground. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he took her face in his hands. His rough, work-worn hands, honest hands, the hands of a man who had built things and lost things and kept going. And he looked at her the way she had been waiting to be looked at for longer than she had understood she was waiting. And then Walter Hayes appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at them. He looked at Nathaniel's hands and Clara's face and the space that had finally closed between them. He said with the perfect timing of a man who had been watching the world for 68 years, and had learned exactly how much silence a moment needed, and when to end it. "Supper ready, men are hungry." Nathaniel dropped his forehead and pressed it briefly against Clara's. Clara laughed a real laugh, unmanaged, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in a very long time. "5 minutes," she told Walter. "Right," Walter said, and disappeared, and Clara could hear from the change in the sound in the dining room that he was telling the men something that was making them respond with the particular noise of people who are pleased about something they've been waiting for. Nathaniel looked at Clara. 5 minutes," he said. "The food doesn't wait," Clara said, and turned back to the stove, and felt him there behind her in her kitchen, in their kitchen, in the place that had been hers the moment she'd been given it, and was something larger and more complicated than hers, now something that had the word home somewhere inside it. She served supper. The men were loud that night, in the best way, the noise of people who had something to celebrate, and were not going to be quiet about it. Pete toasted so many times that Ethan told him to sit down. Cody ate 3 servings without apology. Hector, who rarely said much, stood up at one point and said in his careful English, "This is the best place I have ever worked," and then sat back down as if that required no further elaboration, because it didn't. Walter, at his end of the table, drank his coffee and watched everything with the expression Clara had come to know as his version of happiness, contained and steady and lit from somewhere deep inside, the way certain fires burn. He caught her eye across the table. He nodded once. She nodded back. After, when the table was cleared, and the men had gone and the kitchen was quiet, Nathaniel helped Clara with the dishes without being asked, something he had started doing 3 weeks ago, and that Clara had not commented on, because commenting on it would have required her to acknowledge what it meant to her, and she'd been holding a great deal at the time. They stood at the basin in the warm kitchen, and they talked about Greer's next steps, about the winter supply planning, about something funny Pete had said at supper that neither of them could repeat, without starting to laugh again. They talked the way people talk when they have earned the right to easy conversation, when they have been through enough together that the ordinary feels rich rather than insufficient. When the dishes were done, Nathaniel dried his hands, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "You asked me something once before," Clara said. "Worked out all right." He looked at her. Then he said, "I want you to stay. Not as my cook. Not as my employee. As—" He stopped. Looked for the right word, the way he always looked for the right word properly, without settling. "As the person this place belongs to. As my person. As whatever the word is for the thing you've been since the first week that I didn't have language for, and that Walter had to explain to me in parts." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay, Clara. Permanently. In every sense that word has." Clara looked at him. She thought about the road she'd walked, the job she'd been turned away from, the kitchen in the inn where the innkeeper had laughed, the cot she'd slept on with her cloth bag as a pillow and told herself tomorrow would be different, the 14 miles in a shoe tied with cord, and the gate she'd walked through because she had nowhere else to go and no reason to think it would be different this time, and she had walked through it anyway because that was who she was. She thought about the split stone at the water's bend, unmistakable in character, permanent in nature, still exactly where it had always been, regardless of what anyone tried to claim about it. She thought about what her mother had said. The ground doesn't feel solid because nothing is moving. It feels solid because you keep your weight on it. She had kept her weight on it. All of it. Every single day. And here was the ground she had found. "Yes," Clara said. "I'll stay." Nathaniel smiled, the real one, the unmanaged one, and she smiled back, and outside the Montana night was enormous and dark and full of stars that had been there before either of them, and would be there long after, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was burning steady. In the years that followed, people in that part of Montana Territory told a story. They told it at supper tables, and on church steps, and in the feed store, and in the careful way that communities pass down the things they have decided matter. They told it about Black Pine Ranch, and the woman who had walked through its gate one summer in worn-out boots with everything she owned in a cloth bag. They said she had saved the ranch from a man who tried to take it. They said she had saved the men on it from the kind of slow forgetting that happens when people stop believing anything good is coming. They said she had taken a kitchen that had already surrendered and made it the warmest place in the territory. They did not all say in the formal telling of it that she was a large woman who had been laughed at everywhere she went before she got there. Some things communities know without needing to say no, in the specific way of people who have enough honesty about themselves to understand what they almost missed. What they did say always at the end of it was this: the woman no one wanted turned out to be the one everyone needed, and the man who gave her one chance to prove it turned out to be the one who finally gave her something she had never had in 25 hard years of proving herself to people who weren't paying attention. A place that was hers, a table where she belonged, a man who saw her completely, not despite who she was, not around who she was, but because of it. Every inch of her. The courage and the steadiness and the mother's recipes, and the tied-together boot, and the 25 years of standing straight while people decided she was less than she was. He saw all of it, and he chose all of it. And Clara Whitmore, who had walked 14 miles in a broken shoe to reach a gate she had no reason to believe would be the last one she ever had to walk through. Clara Whitmore went to sleep every night in a house that was her home, in a life that was her own, and knew with the certainty of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for good things to be taken away, that she had arrived exactly where she had always been headed. She had just needed the right gate to walk through, and the courage which she had always had to walk through it anyway.